taxation member and external affairs. He knows a lot of green taxes, so you can come. Thank you for coming. And António Moura Portugal, a lawyer from DLA Piper, expert in aviation and member of RENA, the association who represents the company which operates in Portugal. And thank you for coming. Can we sit? Hi, hello. How are you?
Very well. How are you today?
So we live very tough moments for the aviation. They live the worst crisis, the biggest crisis in his history, with a lot of challenge. And now the challenge is also they are emerging for a big crisis, and then they have another huge challenge away. So I think we need to be prepared for that, and IATA have a lot of things to say to us about this issue. I would like you to make a context of what is happening in Europe, in the United States, everywhere, and which should be the way, and what are the problems. What are you thinking about the new challenge, the climate challenge, that is a huge one, another huge one challenge?
Yeah. Thank you, Anabela, and a good day. I think I would start by prefacing that when I was first invited to come speak to this panel, I thought about the combination of green and the combination of the word taxation. And when you mix these concepts, I think you immediately ask yourself, how does financial really come to meet at a middle ground with environmental and green initiatives? And I think in this respect, there's sensitivities in terms of how you use financial instruments in order to really land at making reducing the carbon footprint and really integrating the airline industry into the green solution, because we are ever more a major contributor to worldwide GDP, economic growth, employment, and all of these other elements. And we really have to think about how we integrate the airline industry into this green solution, and how we collaborate with public, private, and other agencies throughout the world. To think about a little bit across the lines in terms of how we are going to achieve many of the goals that we have 20, 30 years out, and some of the initiatives that are taking place now in this very broad conversation of green taxation and just the environment in general, and how we can help the world, even with our aircraft flying around the world. You know, for more than 100 years, aviation has been a key driver to communicating the world. We see it now in the pandemic, how aviation has come to really be a saving force almost in times of humanitarian, socio-economic crisis. So if we look at these things and some of the initiatives that are taking place, for example, here in Europe, when we take a look across the Atlantic in the United States, just if we take a look here in Europe, we have initiatives such as the European Green Deal right now, with the Fit for 55, with the intention to be in 2030 to reduce emissions by 55%. From the 1990s levels, but of course much more in terms of the long-term initiative, which is geared out to 2050, and
it's a huge goal.
It's a huge goal right now, and I think we will elaborate a little bit more about some of these things that are happening right now, and how you arrive eventually at a net zero carbon emissions. Also, when we think about what's happening in the United States across the Atlantic, we have new proposals now from the Biden administration, where there were significant efforts in trying to arrive at a commitment with the world stage and achieving some of the initiatives that have been talked about, for example, through climate change and the Paris Agreement, and arriving at a 20% at least initial target in the United States. That's what the proposal right now is for investing funds in initiatives like sustainable aviation fuel production and really increasing it. I think you have to think about how the airline industry and the producers of sustainable aviation fuels, shortened version of SAF as it's known by many in the industry, will really meet in the middle, and how you will have not only an increase in the demand from the airline side, but also how you will have the economies of scale that will meet that demand from the airline
Do you
industry.
think they are committed with the subject? They want to be more green? They know that they should be at this issue seriously? The companies and the airlines and everyone, all the ecosystem.
For sure. Yes, absolutely. We have seen how, for example, in last week in Boston, IATA held our annual general meeting in Boston, and we came to a very, very big commitment in that forum, which is to arrive at a net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And that is significant if we think about that the initial targets were to reduce emissions by about 50% from 2019 levels by 2050. So now we're talking about not just a reduction in 50%, now we're talking about net zero, and net zero is a very good thing because versus offsetting with the inputs and outputs in terms of carbon dioxide, now you're talking about you're netting zero into the environment, so there's actually no need to offset with the carbon emission. So this is very yeah, it's a very large initiative. Yes.
And what the industry thinks about taxes? They are against them. They think they are not right when they are too expensive, too high, maybe, or you need another goals. You prefer goals than taxes. You think taxes it's a punishment to the airlines company?
Yes, I think we have to think about taxation in the healthy aspects of taxation, in the form of incentives, in the form of tax credits, that really will create the motivation for the initiatives that we're trying to meet to be advanced upon in a much quicker way. We have to think about things like what the Biden administration in the US is thinking about now, with generating tax credits, which right now in the current proposals, looking at $1.50 to $2 for each gallon of sustainable aviation fuel that is produced, and the goal, for example, of the U.S. to achieve 3 billion gallons of production of sustainable aviation fuels. If you think about the message that sends and how you can work with the production side to start to achieve those economies of scale that I mentioned earlier, you have an aviation policy that will accompany that, because that's also part of the proposal at the moment, that will work with the airline industry to achieve better management of air traffic control, that you reduce, in fact, also the amount of flying that occurs between origin and destination, then you have a synchronized and harmonized way to use taxation, to use fiscal incentives, to be able to really achieve this eventually net zero, but you have to start somewhere. You really have to start somewhere, because you have right now less than 1% of the usage and the production of SAF is used by the airline industry, but you have to get there. And aside from the fact that the cost of SAF is right now 4 times higher than conventional jet fuel. So it's how do you integrate government and private sector, in this case the airline industry, to collaborate together to achieve that, and how do you optimize tax credits and fiscal incentives to be able to achieve the same?
I think António agrees with you at the collaboration, because Portugal just started to apply a carbon taxes, and we know this week that that will cost to the companies and the chips almost around 15 million euros next year. So you were a bit, I don't know, you didn't like this tax because it's 2 euros and you would like to be less, and you don't agree the way the government will use the money to a fund that it's not for the companies but for environment. So what do you want to say to us about this polemic subject?
A lot of things, Anabela, I think, but before I say so, and before I start with the measure that we have at the local level in Portugal, allow me first to pick up on something that Pablo said, because I think it's important, and I think we can only explain the measure we have locally if we understand and if we put in the right context the issue that involves taxation and greener aviation. So, first of all, I think there are several examples that show that aviation recognizes, acknowledges the need to address climate change. Pablo mentioned the recent IATA's General Assembly. We had also last week ICAO's forum in Montreal. And if you look at the agenda, you see that at the forefront and that the first topics that are all related with carbon emissions, how to tackle them, and ambitious programs in order to achieve neutrality. So these are seen by other sectors as ambitious goals, as difficult goals to meet, but the industry is committed and wants to move forward, and this is where it's going to. And apart from that, and apart from what I would say that it's, of course, the willingness and the guidance of the industry, there's also another factor in the equation, which is consumer awareness. I don't know if you saw, but last week Google launched a tool where you can search and where you can be in a position to see how many emissions will your flight in the future produce. So apart from price, consumers will in the future, of course, be sensitive to this. So, and the industry knows that this may be a differentiation factor. So the first point I would like to pick up from Pablo is we are not against, as an industry, and if I'm allowed to speak on behalf of the industry, we are committed to tackle the problem. The second issue is, and of course it comes from someone with the experience as a senior advisor, and that will be in a better position than I am to say it, is global problems demand global answers.
Yeah.
So I think this is something, and a lesson that the aviation sector has learned and has showed us in the past 50 years is that the progress has been made always on the basis of harmonization, of world or European solutions, because it's a global industry. Otherwise you will be leaving room for discrimination, you'll be leaving room for unfair competition.
And nowadays we have a lot of the
countries choices, and it's very easy for you to move your way around. So whenever, and now I'm coming to your question, so and picking the example of the recent Portuguese carbon charge, and if question you make, so if I'm against it, well, let me put it in the context of more than being against or in favor, what I believe is that this sort of charge, this sort of taxes like the one we've adopted in Portugal, for sure it will not contribute for a greener aviation. It will not. And let me tell you why.
Why?
Not because it's cheap, not because it's so. First, because, and for the reasons I mentioned, because it's a local driven initiative, it's regional, it will only apply to passengers here. So what we chose was the form of a ticket tax. Each passenger that departs from Portugal will pay this €2 tax. Secondly, because unlike what the theory and the good practices say, it has not been discussed with the industry. It has been launched in last year's budget law without previous announcement, without any economic study, so we don't know why €2, why the exemptions, and more importantly, and this is the point I would like to highlight, is the lack of adequateness and the lack of efficiency. Because the problem is not to pay €2, the problem is what will you do with those €2? And what happens in our Portuguese carbon charge, which is more a tax than a charge, is that those amounts will be directed to the environmental fund. And if you look to the attributions, if you look to the competences, if you look to the priorities of the environmental fund, you don't see one single measure related to the aviation sector. You don't see what Pablo said about potential policies regarding sustainable aviation fuel. You don't see any incentives for you to change your fleet and the aircrafts, or any incentives for you to change your behavior. So, of course, we can question, well, is this technically an environmental tax? I would say no, it is not. So this is revenue, some collection of €2 that will come to a fund. You can put the label, you can call it environmental tax, but in the end, this will not contribute to any progress in this regard. Finally, and now looking it from a pure and strict local and geographic perspective. So as a Portuguese citizen, as someone that it's in a country that puts tourism as a priority, that has a number of public policies towards and incentivizing the destination as a privileged destination, that is funding a national company and putting money in a national company. So I don't see how the introduction of such a charge with so much inadequateness, how can this be seen as positive, even if you look at it from the angle of competitiveness? Because in the end, this will, of course, put your travel more expensive. If you look, and I know that there are 6, 7, 8 countries in Europe that have similar charges, but if you look at those that are competing with Portugal as a destination, those have not put forward similar initiatives. So I also question the timing. I also question how this fits in the bulk of public policies that we have in Portugal. But of course, in the end, we have to live with it. So,
but you didn't expect that the government go back and finish?
Yes, we do. Yes, yes.
You are trying to speak with them.
I think it's a sign of humbleness. If you do a decision that is not correct, for you to amend it. So it has been now confirmed in this year budget that it will be maintained, but I'm pretty sure that if an adequate study from an economic standpoint, and if the evaluation is made pure and simply from the environmental perspective, I would say the answer is it makes no sense to have it. Unless, and this is the question mark I leave, unless you want someone and you want some charge to cross-subsidize other sectors, to cross-subsidize other policies. That's a question mark that I leave, but in that case, call it, this is a tax that it's applied on airlines or on passengers, that we will use among other hundreds or thousands of revenues that you have in the budget law to fund whatever you want.
So do you think it's a way of punishing airlines?
No, if you want my honest opinion, I think it's easy for you to collect. I think airlines and passengers have been chosen because it's easy for you to collect money from the tickets. It's a ticket tax, so you don't have to implement. So the system is already in place. Cost of compliance will be borne by the airlines that are working to collect the amount. It's a mass service, so you have passengers going. You can collect it with a ticket, so it's easier. It's much easier to implement. And experience shows, and Pablo may comment on this because he has experience in several other jurisdictions, but I think we are always, and airlines are always, and passengers of the aviation sector, they always travel around like a target for the appetite of and the voracity of a state when it comes to collect charges or taxes. So this is how, very honestly, this is how I see it.
And at the end, the tickets will be more expensive because someone has to pay the taxes.
Of course, so then it comes to the economic equation. I'm not sure to which extent, and this has to be studied, airlines will opt to bear themselves the charge or to pass it to the final passenger. If it's the second, of course, yes. So theoretically, all Portuguese passengers will pay an extra €2 from the tariff and from the other already existing airport charges that I may say represent the biggest bulk in terms of costs for an airline operating in Portugal. So we have, on a relative comparison with other countries, we have already and we are paying already for the use of the infrastructure, for passenger service charge, for security charge. Portugal is already expensive for an airline to operate.
So we need global goals, otherwise we have the market distortion. You are worried about that because some countries have taxes, others don't have taxes. So it's you are.
I am, and now I think it's time to hear, and I would love to hear from Pablo the experiences that he has from other countries. What I can say, and to leave it at this stage, what I'm worried is, are we prepared? Are we in a stage as a country to launch this sort of charges? Do we have alternatives? Do we have real alternatives? Is it something that the public opinion agrees? So are we ready to make this mutation and to have and make the privilege for other means of transport? I'm not sure if we had real alternatives. I was looking when I was hearing the minister 30 minutes ago, and what I heard is exactly the opposite. So I hear the praise of the aviation. I hear how important and relevant the aviation is for a peripheral country like we are, and I fully agree. So we cannot import measures like Germany, like Netherlands, like countries that are located in Central Europe that have excellent railways, that have excellent high-speed trains, and where the offer is, for the consumer at least, a real alternative. I don't think we have it, and the only place or the only route where I would say that we could have it would be eventually domestically, Lisbon, Porto, and
otherwise we stay less competitive.
not even Lisbon, Madrid, which is a 1 hour flight, but there's no real alternative to this. So 6 hours by car, or if I have to change train 3 or 4 times, I think for me, as a consumer, this is not an alternative.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. I think what eventually this generates is a lot of market distortion. Even if you think about just the calculation and what you achieve in terms of the new levy, for example, here in Portugal, what if you're thinking about an environmentally oriented ticket tax, how does that really get calculated? What does it really, in effect, benefit consumers? How does it really affect, and how does it positively impact the environment? When we think about other measures here, for example, that are being proposed in Europe, such as eliminating the exemption on on fuel taxes for intra-European flights. When we look at those kind of things, you think about in a 10-year span from 2023 to 2033, you would eventually arrive in a scenario where the tax on fuel for airlines between European cities is going to pretty much represent what the barrel of fuel costs today, anywhere from 90-95%. So if you think about, is there a constructive way to really benefit the industry and the environment from that collection, you really have to take a look back and see, is that the most effective way to incentivize and the airline industry to be able to achieve a greener environment. Also, we have to think about the fact that initiatives like these with fuel taxation, you're eventually going to generate market distortion by having passengers displaced to other airports, because you could have airlines tanking at ports that are going to be cheaper, and you don't want to have this kind of distortion with your non-EU carriers in the case of here in Europe. So there are lots of, I think there are lots of things to really think about that really can synthesize and harmonize with what we are trying to achieve. And it's really not about using taxation as a burdening instrument, but actually using it as a smart instrument to be able to reduce the carbon footprint by aviation, and continuing to capitalize on it being an instrument and a driver for communicating our cities, for generating employment, for fostering economic growth. And I think all of these things have to come together, but they have to come together in a really healthy and green way when we think about taxation more from a fiscal incentive perspective.
And do you think that oil companies and aircraft manufacturers, they are doing their jobs, they are worried with this, they are committed with this? It's important to you, industry, that they make an effort and go forward in this question?
Absolutely.
Or it's not important? So
Absolutely. I think that what will happen eventually is, as you have a smarter way of using these fiscal incentives, you will have, as I mentioned before, you will see an increase in the demand by the airline industry, but you will also see you will also see producers having the incentives to bring down the cost of production, and by so doing, you will reduce the cost of staff for the end user, which are the airlines, and in benefit of not only the environment, but also the consumers in general, which by public policy is what you would like to do.
Okay. I don't know if anyone in the audience wants to make a question or a comment. Maybe not.
I do have.
You want to make a
Anabela,
comment?
so because one point that I believe it's important and that we see is, or two notes. First note is that this is not a problem. Of course, aviations are responsible for a significant number of emissions, so the projections are there, and then, of course, if things go as they are and they are resuming the normal path, this will increase, but things, of course, take time and take investment. So, and one of the things that, and one of the issues that I believe it's relevant is, of course, to look at this, and when we look at taxes, we must look at one of several tools that the policymakers have and that they can use. And personally, I believe that this should be a last resort measure, because I believe that better than taxes, you will have charges. So, and basically, when you have taxes, the issue is that you lose track of the revenue. So the revenue goes to a big bulk, and then you don't know how you will direct the revenue allocated to those taxes. If you look at the charge, at least the charge, taxa in Portuguese, at least you may direct, because in those cases there needs to be a link between what you're paying, and what you'll get. The cost should be enough only to warrant the expense, additional expense that you're raising. So you can evaluate it in a more efficient way. But in my view, better than taxes and better than charges, I think you should have schemes. I think you should have voluntary programs. I think negotiated, of course, with public authorities, with milestones, with objectives, and of course, with penalties for those not meeting those objectives. And I think the market, I think consumer awareness will also play a role as an incentive for airlines to meet or to anticipate those targets. This is something that we're seeing in other industries, that we're seeing in other sectors, is how to market efficiently, how to use efficiently your programs, and in this case as an airline, to go and meet your clients' needs. So the young generation will be sensible, the young generation will look, of course, as I said in the beginning of my presentation, will look at the price, will look at the tariff, but will also look at the emissions. They will also look and they will be worried to see in which aircraft will they fly and how many emissions it will spend. And of course, and let's not forget, and let's not take that, what we see sometimes in the papers, that aviation is a sector that pays huge taxes. It pays, like others, it pays corporate income tax, etc. And the exemptions that exist are mainly due for technical reasons, for practicality reasons, and for the fact that it's highly difficult for you to implement taxation on a global sector when taxation is based on local and regional markets. But this is a challenge that we have since day one of aviation.
Agreed.
That will continue, but it's inherent to the nature of the air transport.
And it needs to be a universal policy, as you say.
For sure, and that's why I cannot understand why Portugal, in the situation, again, that it is, and with the relevance that tourism has, that's why I cannot understand why have we come up with this local and regional initiative of the carbon charge, again, in this timing, and without any concern to allocate those revenues back to the industry. This would make sense for me only if there was a previous dialogue, debate with the industry, if programs were already in place, if we knew that the environmental funds already have in the pipeline programs to support aviation. And yesterday your newspaper came up with an interesting piece of, they call it the super fund, the environmental fund. So, but if you look, you can see all sorts of incumbencies, you can see all sorts of missions for the fund, and none of them, unfortunately, is related with one of the contributing sectors, which is aviation.
And we have any country which could be a good model, a good example for follow, or we are in the beginning and nobody is doing the right thing, or is trying to find a way to solve this problem. There's a model, a country model?
I would say that there are probably a few markets that are leaning in the right direction. I mentioned the case of the U.S. earlier. There is, as of January 20 in Norway, to have a SAF blend that is at least, I believe it's 0.5%. So if we take a look at how that is very sensitively being implemented, I think you really arrive at a figure in which you have thought through very well and planned for what the long-term increment of the SAF or sustainable aviation fuel blend is with traditional kerosene. So if we look at that, for example, that I think brings a good juncture between state and private sector to really understand the underlying factors that you really need to address in order to achieve these things. So I think right now what we see in Portugal in terms of the carbon levy, and in general with what you see on an EU level, probably needs a deeper insight. We really need to expand that conversation, because of course aviation is a willing partner, and I think that message needs to be driven very far. We are a willing collaborator in making the environment greener, And we want to commit not only to that, but also to continuing to provide consumers with cost-effective transportation. And the aviation industry has shown that it's here to stay, but help us make it in that cost-effective, in that healthier, and that greener way.
I forget my watch. I think our time is finishing. I don't know if you want to make some question or one question, or I don't see well, but I think nobody wants to. A final comment, António, or you have already said everything you want to?
I think my final comment is that it's clear, and then of course thanking for Pablo for the input, but I think it's clear that the way forward, in my view, would be with global measures for a global problem, and as far as possible, avoid any obstacles that may be created at the local level, because this will mean in the end, and will lead in the end to double taxation. This will lead to extraterritorial taxation, and will only have one effect, which is to weaken your local operators without any real environmental benefits.
And you want to make a final comment,
Indeed.
Pablo?
Anabela, and I think I would say along the same lines with Antonio, when you look at the international conventions that are out there today, and you look at the Chicago Convention, more than 190 signatory states, if you look at how there's been a traditional exemption of international fuel usage in aviation, it really makes sense from the fact that aviation on an international basis is an extraterritorial activity. So you begin to get into other things from a legal perspective, and mathematical formulas and apportionments and all these things. So the message really is, yes, aviation is here as an active stakeholder in working with government, and also working with agencies to achieve that green objective, because I think it's a common objective, but I think we also have to be sensitive to the fact that I think as a society in general, we also acknowledge the importance of aviation. Aviation is also a reason why we are here today, and
Yes,
why
of course.
many of these events are supported on an international and global scale. So this is.
So thank you for coming and for your vision. I think we all together need to make something to have a better environment. Otherwise, we can't survive as a species. So I think it's a very, very interesting topic, and we need to be aware of them. So good job, good work for you. We need your strength to lead this issue. And thank you for coming to our panel. And good day. Thank you.
Thank you, Annabelle. Thank you, Antonio.
Thank you.